Hi, today I'd like to talk about a topic that is not necessarily everyone's favorite thing to do, and that is gauge swatching. Gauge swatching is just as important in brioche as it can be for any other fabric. Um, and you want to make sure that if you're going to put in the effort to knit a nice big gauge swatch, that you are getting a swatch that is going to give you accurate information. So to do that, the first thing that's most important across both brioche and other kinds of knitted fabric is making sure that your gauge swatch is big enough. And that means knitting a swatch that is at least 6 inches by 6 inches. So you can see here, my swatch is about 8 inches by 7 inches, which is partially because I realized that I needed to use a smaller needle. So how do you know how many stitches to cast on to knit a 6-inch gauge swatch? Well, most patterns provide gauge in the number of stitches in 4 inches. And 4 inches times 1.5 is 6 inches. So if you look at the number of stitches in 4 inches and multiply that by 1.5, you should get roughly the number of stitches in 6 inches. So for example, if your gauge measurement for your pattern says that it is 20 stitches in 4 inches, then 20 times 1.5 is 30 stitches, and that's the number of stitches that should be in 6 inches. And so you want to cast on at least that number, maybe a few extra. Then, when it comes to measuring your gauge, you want to make sure that you're measuring in the middle of your fabric and not right down at the very bottom or top edge, and not right on the very sides, because the edges can slightly distort your gauge measurements. So another thing that's important to consider, and you'll see discussion of this commonly for other kinds of sweaters outside of brioche, is whether you knit your swatch flat or in the round. Now, the recommendation that sometimes swatches need to be knit in the round is because you want to knit your swatch the same way you're going to knit your final fabric. And when you are knitting in the round, generally you are using only knit stitches and not purl stitches, and your gauge for your knit stitches and your purl stitches can be slightly different. So you want to make sure that you swatch in the round if you'll be knitting in the round, in order to maintain your fabric being created in the same way and getting a representative gauge measurement. I'll give you a little permission to cheat on this in brioche, because in brioche, whether you are knitting in the round or flat, you are working both knit and purl stitches for every other column. So the difference between in the round and flat is much less for brioche than it is for other fabrics. That being said, I still recommend swatching in the round for a project that's in the round. But once you've made your swatch, you're going to want to measure the number of stitches in 4 inches. So I'll just put my ruler down, and I recommend using a rigid ruler rather than a measuring tape, because over time a measuring tape can stretch and you can get slightly different measurements that won't accurately give you a good gauge measurement. So for this, I would measure, and I like to count in twos, so that because I count a knit column and a purl column. So in 4 inches, I would have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 stitches. When you're measuring your gauge, you want to move your ruler around to several different places on your fabric. I recommend taking at least 3 or 4 measurements, and then averaging those together, and that is the measurement for your gauge swatch. Now for counting rows in brioche, if you haven't knit brioche before, you might not be aware that working one row with your color A and then working that row again with color B are counted together as one row. So you don't have to worry about counting your two colors. You can just count up one column of your light colored stitches, and I recommend the light color because it will be easier to see, and you can just count up this column to get your number of stitches, count each of the V's, and get your number of rows in 4 inches. Now, one trick I like to use if, like this project for me, I needed to knit more than one gauge swatch because I realized this one was going to be too big. I tie knots in the tail of my swatch equal to the US size of my needle. So I knit this swatch on a US 8, and there are 8 knots in my tail, and that can make it easier to keep track of your swatches. I also want to recommend when you're doing this process that you check your gauge both before and after you block your swatch. And yes, you do need to block your swatch if you're going to block your final item, which I always recommend. And the value of measuring your gauge before and after is it lets you understand how your fabric is going to change after blocking. And it also lets you know if you are working on your final garment and you feel like your gauge may have changed relative to what you were knitting on during your gauge swatch, you can then measure the gauge of your working fabric and compare it to your pre-blocking measurement to see if you really have had a shift in how you're knitting. When it comes to blocking your swatch, you will want to block it exactly the same way that you plan to block your final garment. So I recommend filling a basin with some tepid water and eucalyptus or soak or your preferred wool wash. I use eucalyptus, and submerging your swatch in that bath for at least 15 minutes with brioche, because you can have high contrast between your colors. Sometimes you can get color bleeding, so I tend to be very strict about keeping my block to just 15 minutes to try and reduce the risk of color bleeding. Then you'll want to take your swatch out, gently wring it out, lay it flat in a towel, roll up your towel so it would be, like this inside of a towel, and squish the towel to squeeze out as much water as possible, then very gently lay your swatch flat. You'll want to check your pattern to see if it tells you if your gauge measurement is based on a stretched or an unstretched fabric. When in doubt, I would recommend going with an unstretched fabric unless it tells you otherwise. So to me, that means very gently just patting out my swatch, not stretching it, not pinning it, just laying it flat and seeing how it dries. Once it's dry, you can come back and take your gauge measurements again for your stitch gauge and your row gauge, and then you can compare those to your before blocking measurements. And you will always want to use your after blocking measurement to assess what gauge you're getting and if you need to change needle sizes for your final project. I hope that this has been helpful and that this makes it easier for you to confidently go forward working on your next brioche garment. Thank you for watching.